Mr. President, I'm honored to join my colleagues here to talk about President Bush. The outpouring of appreciation from the country has been significant. I know his son, the 43rd president, said that it takes a long time for the determinations of history to come in. I think the 41st president had almost 25 years for people to begin to put his presidency in the right kind of historical reference, the right context of looking back and seeing not only what happened then, but what happened since then because of what happened then. And I'm pleased that he and Barbara were able to live long enough after that significant presidency to see what happened. Certainly in Missouri, we claim part of the Bush family. His mother grew up in Missouri. The Walkers were from Missouri, and he treated Missouri like it was one of the states that he was connected to by relationship. His Uncle Herbert, along with his grandfather and later his Uncle Herbert and the rest of the family, would go in the summer to Walker's Point, named after that Missouri part of his family, just like the Walker's Cup is named after that part of his family. The impact of his mother, pretty great. I heard the president talking the other day on an interview with Jenna Bush about who he would look for when he got to heaven, and that was a couple of years ago, I think, and he said, well, if Barbara has gone there first, I think the right answer would be, I'm going to look for her first. But then he said, and I think my mom and my dad, he said their daughter that they had lost when she was 3, Robin, but his mother was an important part of his life, and you could tell that in talking to him or his children that remembered their grandmother, and you could see a lot of what she taught him in him, that competitive nature. You know, they don't need sporting cups after your family unless your family begins in competition. But that competitive nature, but also that competitive nature that was also based on never bragging about yourself. Now, to be a real competitor like the president was and not brag about yourself, not always an easy thing, but certainly maybe to his political detriment, was part of his upbringing. Another part of his upbringing was sort of the upbringing of, in many ways, the best values of that World War II generation. Stand up straight, take responsibility, share credit, take blame. Those were all part of who George Herbert Walker Bush had become. That idea that you should do what you're supposed to do, that idea of the importance of service to others. If you're going to be part of the team, but if you're President Bush, I heard John Meacham, his biographer, say that he tried to kind of get into the depth of that. What about this commitment to service? And aren't there lots of ways to do that? And can't you have service without recognition? But President Bush, understanding the conflict actually in what he believed and the profession he had pursued, said, well, there's nothing wrong if you're going to be on the team to want to be captain of the team, whether it's captain of the Yale baseball team, which he was, or president of the United States. And the Yale baseball team, Mr. President, leads me to another thing that you and I know when we think about him, the willingness as a young man to serve and to serve immediately. In fact, at 17, still in high school, after Pearl Harbor, he talked about going to Canada to join the Canadian Air Corps because you could do that at 17, but in our country, you couldn't join the Air Corps until 18. There was no Air Force yet. It was the Army Air Corps or the Navy Air Corps. And he was persuaded by, I assume, his mom and dad and others, well, just let's finish high school. Let's finish high school first. And then when you're 18, you can join the U.S. Air Corps, which he did, I believe on his 18th birthday, or really close to his 18th birthday, to become then the youngest aviator in the war at the time he got his flying credentials and serving in that way. That was part of that generation. But then the war is over, and he and Barbara get married right before the end of the war, and then he goes to college. Then he goes to college. That young man with a wife and a baby goes to college, becomes the captain of the baseball team. A man really always great athletic ability, great grace in so many ways, grace under pressure, grace with others, but grace in sports as well, and the ability to do that. Now, when you're the captain of the Yale baseball team, you can talk a lot about the team instead of yourself. When you decide to enter politics, there's an almost total contradiction between pursuing political office and not talking about yourself. It just doesn't quite work that way. You have to be willing to do that, and you could always see in President Bush that reluctance to cross the line his mother had taught him and talk about himself, talk about the accomplishments, and even at his best, he was held back in many ways by that reluctance to what he would see as bragging on himself, but his public service was significant and broad-based. I believe you could make the case that perhaps no one had ever been better prepared to be president than George Herbert Walker Bush. But in that effort to become president, you have to run first. Remember in 1980, hearing Barbara Bush talking about, I remember this because it's so unusual. I don't remember anybody else saying anything like this when they decided to run for president. In 1980, when he ran for president, I heard Barbara Bush say, when asked, well, this guy's run for Congress once. It's the only elected office he's ever had, the House of Representatives, and re-elected. And she said, yes, but George has a big family. I can hear her say, has a big family and thousands of friends. Now we see at the end of his life how that friends network continued to be an important part of who he was, but I don't recall a single other person ever successfully running for president on the basis that that he has a big family and lots of friends. But that was his unique way to associate with people. Those thousands of letters he wrote, as the vice president said yesterday that he wrote to friends over the years, and as it turned out in retirement, the letters he wrote to almost anybody that would write him. He would respond, as again his mother probably taught him to do. If somebody takes the time to write you, you take the time to write them back. He was a man of appreciation and thank you notes and sympathy notes, and that network of friends and family eventually became very important. Now, where I live in Missouri, we were the ultimate bellwether state for about 100 years. My friend from Ohio would come close to being able to take that crown for Ohio. Ohio's usually been with the winner in presidential elections. But for 100 years, we voted from 1904 to 2004, we voted for the winner every time but one. And so that last part of that last 20 years of that time period very much is the time period where President Bush, 41, and Bush, 43 for that matter, were part of national politics. So Missouri would have been a significant place for him anyway, but his brother lived there, his younger brother Bucky, who passed away in the last few years. Future Ambassador Burt Walker was there. Lots of sort of interrelated and connected family members. And so we saw candidate Bush and then Vice President Bush and then President Bush in our state a lot. I was the elected Secretary of State when he was Vice President and was the Secretary of State when he was President. And so I had the chance to benefit from knowing him, the chance to go to Walker's Point a few times, to go to church with the Bushes. And if you were with the Bushes on a Sunday, either you were going to be left by yourself or you were going to go to church, because that was as much a part of who President Bush was as anything else, maybe a bigger part than anything else. He said as in his faith, the Episcopal faith, maybe he wasn't as sharing publicly of his faith, but he was absolutely, Mr. President, committed to his faith. In fact, a chapel, he raised the money to build a chapel at Camp David during his presidency. There had not been a chapel there before. A number of presidents had, starting with Franklin Roosevelt, had used Camp David, but it was President Bush who decided, well, the church services on Sunday in the cafeteria could be in a better place. Let's do what we can. So he raised the money privately to build the chapel that is there today. The Missouri connection goes a little bit further. Not only did Missouri vote for President Bush in 1988, and if my story was going to have any truth to it, I'd have to point out voted for Bill Clinton in 1992 because we were still voting for the winner by pretty much the margin of whatever was the national average in the last 50 years of that 100-year saga. But after Desert Storm, President Bush looked around to find a place to do the first 4th of July parade after Desert Storm, and he came to Marshfield, Missouri, in the county where I was born, in Webster County. I was going to be the grand marshal of the parade that year, as I recall. But when it became apparent that the president wanted to come to be in that parade, I was more than willing to concede that he should be the grand marshal of that parade, and walked not too far behind him. And then in 1992, after the convention, I believe the first campaign kickoff was at Branson, Missouri, and I had the chance to be there with him. We went to a country music show at the Mo Bandy Theater, and Loretta Lynn was sitting with the president and Mrs. Bush, and their good friend from Texas, Mo Bandy, was performing, and that was a part of America and a part of our music that the president loved. I think the kickoff rally itself was outside in the parking lot at Silver Dollar City. The Herschen family was there. Jody Herschen, just this week, died as well after a long fight with cancer. But all of those connections goes back to big family and thousands of friends. There was nowhere in that matrix that I just talked about where President Bush didn't leave with more friends than he had when he came, and friends and many times that he figured out how to develop a lifelong connection to. All of us could use more of that skill, and social media and the quick response and the letter writing, the phone calling, the thinking about when you need to reach out to people in a way that they can transparently feel it continues to be important. The other things are not unimportant either, but his connectedness took a little more effort than some of ours do. Let me just say, in terms of preparation and how it paid off, a CIA director, a member of Congress, the first envoy to one of the very first envoys to China before we had official relationships, the envoy to the United Nations, Vice President of the United States, making connections and contacts and friendships. So Desert Storm, Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait. The president says, this will not stand. And then he assembled what may have been the greatest coalition of nations at any time. The nations that weren't willing to fight were often willing to help others pay for the fight. I don't know if anybody else could have put that coalition together the way President Bush did. But he put that coalition together and with maximum force and to guarantee minimum loss, suddenly freed Kuwait and showed that the U.S. was still going to stand up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves. And then, Mr. President, the collapse of the Soviet Union, we have just enough time now to look back, and I've heard many others in the last few days talk about how that could have gone so badly wrong for all of the other countries that were trying to emerge from the domination of Russia and the Soviet Union. But George Herbert Walker Bush, on the phone, reaching out, talking to leaders, seeing the things that would have thought that actually had just been predicted by the West Germans themselves to be impossible, that somehow East Germany could become part of West Germany, is exactly what happened. The president encouraged, stood beside, went out of the way to be sure that Helmut Kohl, the leader of West Germany, had the kind of support that he and his government needed to reach out and bring this country that had been isolated for 40 years, this part of their country, back into the country, that all of these East European countries that were emerging from Soviet domination had a chance to move from domination to democracy. That would not have happened the way it happened if somebody less prepared and less capable had been there. Character paid off then. Character is being recognized today for the value it has. As thousands have walked by the casket in the rotunda of the Capitol of the United States of America, millions of others have thought about what a life of character means. They've thought about what the willingness to take responsibility means. They've thought about how important it is to share credit, to take blame, to be prepared, to believe that there is great value and virtue in serving others. That's what George Herbert Walker Bush did. As we think back at the impact he and Mrs. Bush and their family have had on the country, there's a great lesson to be learned there. I hope, Mr. President, we're all taking time to learn it.